Now we are live. Okay.
Here we go.
Here we go. Sorry for that.
Okay.
So it is my absolute pleasure to be here for Australian Wildlife Week. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking a little bit about Australia's amphibians and particularly the FrogID project for which you can all get involved and contribute to frog conservation. So Australia's frogs, what do we know? Well, actually, we don't quite even know how many species of frog we have in Australia. If you'd asked me about a year ago, we would have had sort of 242 or so. It went up to 247 a little while ago. And a couple of months ago, we actually, one species disappeared because we realized it was actually part of another species. So we're in this sort of weird part of, you know, we've got these amazing frogs at this point in time, 246 native species, plus the introduced cane toad. But we're discovering them. So it's far more often that we're actually discovering these species than we are sort of synonymizing them. But there's been about 6 species new to science described in the last couple of years, which is completely insane. And this includes species from Sydney and Brisbane, as well as from more remote areas. And those frogs, they're circled in yellow, are species that have been described as new to science recently. The little sort of shrunken one in the top right is a species that is up in Arnhem Land and you don't actually have any photographs of the frogs in life. Whereas the screaming tree frog, the species with the big vocal sac in the middle surrounded by yellow, that was discovered by my colleagues and I about a year ago after much detective work. So yeah, we're in a situation where we still don't even know how many frogs we have, but we have a huge diversity of frogs and almost all of them only occur in Australia. Unfortunately, we have a terrible track record in frog conservation. So at least 4 species of Australian frog are extinct, and there's several more that are missing in action. So we haven't seen them and we suspect they are extinct. And 40 species, and this is increasing every time I give a talk almost, 40 species are currently listed as threatened with extinction. And so that includes 7 species that are critically endangered, which is of course the last step before extinction, which is utterly awful. And some of these are well known, like the corroboree frog, that little sort of bright yellow and black frog there, which is quite famous, and others are less well known. The threats facing frogs are varied and in many cases very similar to that for other biodiversity in Australia. So habitat modification, introduced species, climate change. Frogs are kind of whatever temperature their surrounding is. And so they are really impacted by climate change and already responding there. And disease is a huge threat as well to frogs. So even within protected areas, sort of pristine places, that doesn't stop disease from getting in, unfortunately. So that's one of the main drivers for threatening frogs in Australia. But why should we care? So frogs are actually really, really important, even though they're actually small themselves. They're a very, very important part of ecosystems. And in many ecosystems, if you were kind of to pile up all the frogs and pile up all the mammals and all the birds, the frog part would actually be the biggest. They are a very important part of food webs, energy dynamics, nutrient flows. So they typically have a tadpole in the water that then is sort of a grazer that then develops into a frog on the land. So there's sort of this big connection, a bit like glue that sort of connects freshwater and terrestrial systems. They're a key part of food webs. The tadpoles graze on algae, adults eat tons of invertebrates, including pests, and are also eaten by a lot of animals. So in the places where they disappear, we notice, you know, all the other animals that rely on frogs for food start to disappear. There's also some selfish reasons why we should want frogs around as well. So, for example, they're being investigated quite a bit in human medicine. And so the glue on the notodon frog, that holy cross frog you can see there, that kind of goo on it, has actually been investigated for use in human surgery, so like knee cartilage repair, which is pretty amazing because it says sticky wet as dry. And lots of other things, antibacterials, antifungals, antibiotics, all sorts of things. You know, we might actually have frogs to thank for curing our next illness. And of course, they are very sensitive bioindicators. So by monitoring frogs, we can get an understanding of the health of the environment. And like much of Australia's biodiversity, one of the big obstacles in conserving our frogs is our lack of knowledge. So not only how many species we have, but this is a map of frog records. And you can see Sydney there on the right. And you don't actually have to go very far from Sydney to get large parts of Australia where there are no official frog records. And so when it comes to making conservation decisions based around frogs, we desperately need more information. Now, this is where the FrogID project has come in, and FrogID was launched in November 2017, so almost 5 years now. And it's based around two things. One is that frogs call. Each species has a unique call. And the other is that we walk around with this amazing piece of technology most of the time in our pockets. And so simply by recording the calls of frogs, we're able to sort of understand what species are calling where and sort of map our frog biodiversity. And of course, I hope you all download the FrogID app. It's free for your smartphone. And it's also a little field guide as well, so you can learn about frogs as well as contributing to our understanding of them. And what you actually, I guess, get with that, so every submission comes to myself and a team of frog biologists at the Australian Museum, and we listen to those calls. It's not yet a frog Shazam, and they're identified by somebody to species with latitude and longitude and everything, and we're building this amazing database. So this is currently a map of where frog records have been obtained through FrogID. Like any citizen science project, you can see it's where the people are, but we also have amazing records of frogs. 30,000 users. We've got about 720,000 frog records across Australia in less than 5 years. And to put that in perspective, before FrogID, we had less than 500,000 records of frogs in total across Australia. So it's going gangbusters, which is absolutely amazing. And you can see, particularly over time, we've been getting a lot more recordings, particularly in summer. And of course, last year during FrogID week, it was absolutely insane. We got over 20,000 records in FrogID week. And this is a bit of a shout out to FrogID week next month, which is from the 11th to the 20th. So we hope to beat that peak there next month. What are we learning? We're learning about where frogs are disappearing. So for example, the good old green tree frog disappearing from Sydney. We're getting fantastic records of threatened species, particularly where the community uses FrogID as a tool to monitor their local frogs, like the little Sloan's froglet being monitored by the Sloan's champions down near Albury-Wodonga. It has been a bit of an apocalypse for Australia's biodiversity since FrogID started. So we've had no idea that we would be able to then examine the impact of drought, the impact of the Black Summer bushfires, and more recently the impact of a mortality event in frogs. And so FrogID has been this amazing database that we have data pre and post as well, and so we're examining those things. Also, the impact of land use change, for example, ranking Australia's species according to how sensitive they are to modification, so we can try and figure out what frogs are most sensitive and what they need in terms of being able to coexist with us in suburban areas. We're monitoring invasive species such as the cane toad, so getting records and hopefully understanding more about its impact on frogs. And we're also using the audio recordings in particular to discover new Australian frog species. So each species has a bit of a different call, and so we're realising that there's some strange accents out there, and we're using that to investigate how many species we really do have. The FrogID data sets are integrated into state and wildlife territory atlases, so you can get it on the ALA and you can get all that data, and it's also been incorporated, recommended for use by New South Wales and federal government as well, which is really fantastic. But perhaps the most important thing, and I'm all for the data, and as a scientist, I'm super excited by that, has actually been the engagement with local communities. So some of the feedback we've got, some of my favourites, 3 months ago I knew nothing about frogs. Now it's all I see and hear. Another bit of feedback. As a farmer, I feel that it's good to know what types of frogs are about and how they're going in the environment. The health of my waterways through the property is important. This project keeps me in touch with which species are around and can be telling as to what is happening to my water health. And finally, within a very short space of time, our frog knowledge and awareness has expanded. And recently, very late one evening, after being on the road for 11 hours, we passed through a shower of rain and we didn't think twice at pulling the car off the highway for frogs. Our life has become far richer. Sometimes, as we all know, it can be incredibly depressing to be a wildlife biologist, a conservation biologist anywhere in the world. And frogs is sort of a case where there's not always such great news about them. And so I must say the FrogID project has kind of restored my hope in our ability to work together to save frogs. And you know, there are more than 30,000 people that have been willing across Australia to stand in the dark, in the cold, often in the rain, and get their phone out and record frogs. And so it's quite clear, you know, that if we are to turn things around, if we are to save Australia's biodiversity and have future generations inherit the amazing biodiversity we are so lucky to have around us, that the only way that we can do that is by working together. And FrogID has been an amazing experience in that. Thank you so much.